Greetings and welcome back to those of you who are joining us here at the University of Chicago, and also a welcome to you who are joining us online. This is the keynote that you're going to hear is part of a larger symposium called the Quandaries of Biotechnology, Theory and Practice. And while we did not live stream the full program, it will be available at a later date on our website and on our YouTube channel. So please do follow us there. My name is Michael Le Chevalier. I am the Senior Associate Director at the Lumen Christi Institute. If you're not familiar with Lumen Christi, I like to say that we like to make the Catholic intellectual tradition in its depth and breadth a living dialogue partner at the University of Chicago. Living because we bring great scholars here who are steeped in that tradition, who think with that tradition, who teach it, and in dialogue because we engage those who are beyond that tradition, not only in other Christian traditions, in other religious traditions, but also especially in dialogue with the full range of disciplines that you find within the modern university. Before I introduce our speaker and mention the title of his talk, I want to extend a special gratitude first to the co-sponsors of this program, the program on medicine and religion here at the University of Chicago, and the Albert Carnegie Center for Healthcare Ethics at St. Louis University. I also want to extend a special word of gratitude to the organizing committee who have made this program possible, who've done all the work in pulling together great speakers so that we have this rich conversation. John Paul Hale, who has been a key coordinator in convening and organizing and bringing all this work to bear. Peter Tierney, who is also the co-director with me of the Templeton grant that is funding this initiative. Jeff Bishop from St. Louis University, and Stephen Meredith from the University of Chicago. It was a pleasure to actually also work with him on the first iteration of this symposium, I think now 6 years ago, is that right? And we hope to do another one next year that will be engaging more specifically artificial intelligence. So everyone here, please stay tuned. And if you have ideas, certainly reach out to us. I also want to thank the Templeton Foundation, the John Templeton Foundation that has paid for this program and made it possible, as well as the broader work that we're doing at the University of Chicago in science and religion. Our keynote lecture is entitled today, Populations, Persons, and Precision Medicine, the Ethics of Emerging Information Technologies in Genetics and Medicine. And it is going to be offered by Paul Scherz, who is an associate professor at the University of Virginia. He holds the rare distinction of being the only person I know who has a PhD in human genetics and a PhD in theology. And we are also delighted that Paul will be teaching a summer seminar that is being organized through the Lumen Network with the Fons Vitae Institute at Duke University and the Lumen Christi Institute on artificial intelligence, ethics, and Catholic thought. So please join me in thanking our distinguished speaker.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to the organizers and to Lumen Christi for inviting me here today to this wonderful symposium. There's been a great series of speakers today, and I'm glad to be able to be a part of it. And thank you all for being here and for tuning in to this lecture. So bioethicists, especially theological bioethicists, have long criticized the reductionism, determinism, and individualism inherent in highly technological medicine. They, and I include myself in this group, argue that biotechnologies threaten to reduce the body to mere mechanistic functions. In this reductionism, the person may be lost, as well as the teleological ordering of the organism, leaving the body open to the arbitrary will of the patient, doctor, or whomever wields power. Further, the communal aspect of health and the person are displaced in the focus on the individual body. This line of criticism has been tremendously productive, identifying many of the dangers of new biotechnologies. In this talk, though, I would like to highlight a different danger. It concerns a way of thinking that has become a dominant paradigm governing the technological developments in medicine over the last 20 years. Instead of being viewed as an individualized bodily machine, under this other paradigm, the patient is viewed in terms of the population. Such an emphasis is seen in theorizations of population health and population-based medicine that are now guiding the development and implementation of genetic technology and medical informatics. This population paradigm has generally received less attention from specifically Catholic bioethics, as well as bioethicists more broadly, although there has been some kind of focus on it, and Jeff Bishop has dealt with it, and many social scientists have alerted us to its dangers. Now, of course, a population-based paradigm has long guided the field of public health, which investigates social and physical conditions that alter rates of disease, such as poverty or unsafe water supplies, right? And is shaping medicine's focus on the social determinants of health. What's new and worthy of consideration is the deployment of this paradigm in clinical medicine, biotechnology, and information technology. In this talk, I want to explore this population perspective, describing its history and some of its basic characteristics before discussing its ethical challenges. Let me begin, though, by giving 3 examples to show that a population perspective is really truly making inroads into biotechnology and thus clinical medicine. These 3 examples are polygenic risk scores in precision medicine, the application of precision medicine in clinics, and gene editing. First, an essential tool of the Post-Human Genome Project genetics and its clinical implementation in precision medicine is the polygenic risk score. In the more deterministic understanding of genetics that existed before the Genome Project, researchers estimated that humans had approximately 100,000 genes, which led many geneticists to believe that it was likely that they could find genes that were major contributors for each common disease. So they could find a heart disease gene, a diabetes gene, and so forth. It was a reductionist deterministic model of genetic causation. People were looking for single mutations that caused a single disease. And this model does work for many congenital diseases, like sickle cell anemia, which was discussed earlier. These few genes could then be targeted for cures, either pharmacological or genetic, like the recently approved gene therapy for sickle cell. However, the Genome Project found that we only have 20 to 25,000 genes, not the 100,000 genes that were predicted. I remember the shock that many researchers felt when these initial findings were announced. This is the same number of genes as a nematode worm, meaning that humans achieve immensely more complexity and capability with approximately the same number of genes as a worm. Thus, there can't be any one-to-one gene-disease correspondence, no heart disease gene. Instead, much depends on how genes are regulated and how they interact, meaning that there is a lot of flexibility in how the genome specifies our traits. It became obvious that our genetic makeup is too complex for simple deterministic cures. With genetic cures of common disease receding from view, the field had to find something to do with its wealth of data and expensive sequencing infrastructure. So it has turned to predicting risk. Researchers started running what are called genome-wide association studies that examine thousands of DNA sites across the genome that vary between people. These are differences in a single DNA base pair. So in the slide, you see this one variant here, which you have a G or a T kind of in one version or another. The details aren't too important and are somewhat complex, but basically what geneticists do is take a population of thousands of people, measure a trait like height, intelligence, or diabetes, or analyze it from their electronic medical records, and see whether each genetic variant is correlated with the trait. So you could see that, say, this genetic variant means that somebody has, say, a 0.3% higher likelihood of having diabetes than average. This one, if they had that variant, it have a less likelihood of diabetes by 0.06%. By adding all of the increased and decreased risks across the genomes, researchers determined what is called a polygenic risk score, the risk that a person will have a trait. In the slide, you would add 0.3 plus 0.08 and subtract 0.06 to get the final score, which is a 0.32% increased risk. So for heart disease, a person who had many variants that increased the risk of heart attack would be at high risk. There would be others who would be low risk because of their specific gene variants. Now, this might seem to give an individualized view of risk, but it doesn't. Instead, it places a patient in a stratified risk group, a population. It tells them whether they were at higher or lower risk for a certain disease than is average in the population. It tells them where on this curve they sit, here, here, here. That still leaves a great deal of interpretive work to be done to decide how to apply that risk score to an individual. A risk score is quite limited in its predictive value for individuals. Even the best of the current polygenic risk scores rarely predict much more over 10% of the variance in a trait. That leaves most of the variability in a population unexplained. Moreover, there is a tremendous variability even within people sharing a risk score. Let's say that a person's risk score is in the highest 10 percentile of risk. People within that group will show broad distributions of outcomes, describing a broad bell curve. In fact, the outcomes of many people at high risk will overlap with many people at low risk, which raises questions of what such population-based scores really tell us. So these polygenic risk scores are comparing the individual, placing them within a broad population. My second example is the implementation of AI in the clinic in precision medicine. Gene variants and polygenic risk scores have become one more factor to incorporate into a medical risk analysis. Along with asking whether you smoke, drink, or have high blood pressure, medical practitioners can analyze your genetics. We now have the technical power to start integrating much of this information. That's exactly what governments are investing in through biobank research projects, like the NIH's $1.5 billion, 1 million person All of Us program. These projects use the power of data analytics to combine the information from these risk scores, medical records, physiological markers, and even perhaps non-medical data like social media to give an individualized prediction of future health. The rapid development of AI has been critical for this project. Only computer programs can analyze the vast amounts of data available and find patterns that can serve for prediction. Health systems are beginning to integrate different kinds of information and tools into the clinical workflow, such as AI-driven clinical decision support systems, or the inclusion of genetic information in medical records. These systems will recommend medications and tests to the practitioner in real time. Again, these programs might seem to be giving individualized care, but really they are giving statistical predictions. As one AI researcher told me early when I started to research AI is just statistics. Right? All its AIs are doing is taking a large amount of data, determining correlations, and using those to predict the future. And statistics describe a population. So within a certain population, what is the likelihood a person with these characteristics will have a certain outcome? This population-based feature is recognized in the title of programs like UCSF's Precision Population Health Program or UVA's research program developing precision medicine for populations. One might object that these are just new information technologies and don't affect the traditional biotechnology that have long been criticized as reductionist, such as genetic manipulation or assisted reproduction. However, even something as individualized and seemingly reductionist as gene editing is now being directed towards population effects. Take, for example, recent trials of a gene editing therapy that uses CRISPR-Cas9 base editing tools delivered by nanoparticles to mutate the PCSK9 gene in the liver. So PCSK9 is a gene involved in cholesterol metabolism, with its mutations causing lower levels of cholesterol in the blood. Over the past decade, biotech companies have introduced monoclonal antibodies and other therapies targeting PCSK9 in order to reduce cardiac disease risk. These therapies can drastically reduce cholesterol levels, but they're expensive and somewhat inconvenient. Verve Therapeutics has designed a more permanent solution through gene editing, knocking the gene out. Initially, the phase 1 trial was targeted at people suffering from hypercholesterolemia, a condition of chronically high cholesterol resulting from a genetic mutation. The subject's cholesterol levels were poorly controlled by current therapies. Though it's initially targeted at patients with a classic genetic disease, a single gene mutation, the biotech company sees a much broader market once the therapy is approved. They want it to become like a vaccine for heart attacks and replace the chronic care model for heart disease. It would be a potential genetic blockbuster, a genetic statin, if you will, which would escape the problem of small markets afflicting many gene editing technologies. We've had numerous gene editing technologies come on the market over the last decade, and many of these have had to be withdrawn because there's so few people with the diseases that they cost $1.5 million or $2 million to be put. So if you could have something like this, which you could be addressed to a large population, that would in part solve their profitability problems. At this point, though, the treatment is no longer repairing an error or mutation in a metabolic pathway. It's then a population-based preventive treatment, as with something like statins. High levels of cholesterol don't deterministically cause cardiac disease. They merely raise their probability. And one must statistically examine a population to see this elevated risk. It's not a treatment directed primarily at individuals. After all, according to some meta-analyses, you need to treat 286 healthy people with statins to prevent one death. It's lower to prevent one heart attack and other kind of cardiac outcomes, but for one death. The effect of gene editing would likely be similar. The population is thus a central concept for biotechnology. In identifying this shift, I'm following people in drawing on the work of historians and social theorists inspired by the thought of Michel Foucault. Foucault theorized that political power has developed a new interest in life in the modern period. This focus on life operates through two mechanisms. Alongside his more famous concept of discipline, which directly shapes the individual through fairly intensive mechanisms of surveillance and coercive institutions, there's biopolitics. It, quote, focused on the species bodies, propagation, births, mortality, the level of health, life expectancy, and longevity, with all the conditions that can cause these to vary. Their supervision is effected through an entire series of interventions and regulatory controls, a biopolitics of the population. Note that Foucault's and my understanding of biopolitics is different than Giorgio Agamben's more recent invocation of the concept. Agamben disregards Foucault's attention to the statistical mechanisms like insurance that undergird contemporary interventions into life. Instead, Agamben focuses solely on the operations of sovereign power. To my mind, though, the use of statistics and population-based concepts are the most important phenomena revealed by the scholarship on biopolitics. Now, to go back to give a kind of a history, where did this idea of population come from? It has a long history, emerging with the earliest social scientists and statisticians. In the late 18th century, European states had begun to gather more and more data on their societies, births, deaths, production, and so on. As mathematicians began examining these data sets, they discovered surprising irregularities. Certain averages would stay nearly constant from year to year: crime, dead letters, even suicides, as Durkheim so famously discussed. These regularities led statisticians to postulate an entity, the population, that displayed these features. A population is therefore a hypothetical construct made up of many individuals that displays regularities over time. Exactly why the population was so regular was unclear, leading to many proposed explanations. Adolphe Quetelet, for example, believed that each nation approximated a national ideal type of height, weight, intelligence, and so forth that embodied a national average. Quetelet postulated that individuals would diverge from this national ideal type according to mathematical error theory along a normal curve. Other scholars suggested roots for these regularities in cultures, still others in sociological structures. The important feature and explanation for this talk, though, is that the way that the population moved from social science into genetics in the form of eugenics. People began to suspect that population-level regularities identified by early social scientists were changing for the worse. For example, the number of people in asylums rapidly rose throughout the 19th century. Crime, poverty, and similar social ills also seemed to climb over the course of the century. People sought theories and tools that would help them understand and control these apparent trends. Many scholars turned to theories that suggested hereditary flaws, views that would lead to eugenics. After Darwin published his theory of natural selection, some commentators saw the problem as a relaxing of selective pressures in modern society, suggesting that charitable and social welfare institutions allowed too many of what they called the unfit to survive and reproduce. Such ideas led to eugenic policy suggestions, such as the segregation and forced sterilization of those deemed unfit, and ultimately the genocidal policies of the Nazis. To move beyond these broad speculations, scientists sought analytic tools to discover biological mechanisms for social problems. It was Francis Galton, Darwin's cousin, who provided these tools. Galton envisioned a pool of hereditary characters that are passed on from one generation to another. He also began gathering data on family lines, trying to determine mechanisms of transmission of traits like intelligence. To analyze these data, he created central concepts in statistics like correlation and regression. Carl Pearson, Galton's biographer and protege, systematized and further developed Galton's insights. Pearson was the one who really built the scientific infrastructure that led statistics to become its own discipline. But this was also tied together with the rise of eugenics as its own discipline. His field of biometrics sought to better characterize the traits of populations insofar as they were hereditarily derived. To do so, he collected huge amounts of data from asylums and other institutions for eugenic analysis. It was Pearson whose endeavors gave us the tools to interrogate the population. These tools, when combined with genetic deterministic ideas, drove horrible programs of eugenics. Now, this dark history of eugenics is a well-worked scholarly field, so I'm not going to get into it in any depth here. Suffice it to say that because of intellectual difficulties, the horrors of Nazism, and other social pressures, it ceased to be a viable political movement for enacting social policies. Instead, it retreated to other areas, such as family and genetic counseling. In terms of scientific research, population genetics developed as an important subfield of evolutionary biology, but usually disconnected from social goals. Even though scientists like sociobiologists who address social questions rarely offered much in terms of solutions, seeing fundamental limits to how social programs could transform biologically based problems. So the population program in genetics eventually disappeared. It was replaced as Lily Kay's history shows, by a Rockefeller Foundation research initiative in the 1930s to investigate the molecular mechanisms of life, a program that gave rise to molecular genetics. It was molecular genetics that introduced the reductionist determinist vision criticized by bioethics. And that was the version that was alive in the time when bioethics arose in the 1970s. In this version, genes were thought of deterministically giving rise to particular proteins which would engage in molecular processes that determine an organism's characteristics. The Human Genome Project looked to be the fulfillment of the molecular genetic research program, yet as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, there were many fewer genes than predicted, leading to a much more complex picture of how genes relate to disease. And that's the one that gives us the polygenic risk score, and a return in biology to this much earlier population perspective. Okay, so that's where the history of the population perspective comes from in biology. But let me define in a little more detail what taking a population perspective includes. First, it involves consideration of a collective of some sort, rather than an individual. This collective can be an ethnic group of relatively common descent, a city, a health system, and so forth. This collective is not envisioned as a community tied together by relational bonds, though. Instead, the individuals are only related through a common statistical description, certain regularities. They are like gas molecules in a physics equation. They are also considered to be uniform, other than the variables of interest. At least that's what statistical methodologies try to achieve. Second, the collective is structured in terms of a regular distribution of a variable of interest. Ideally, it's structured as a normal curve. Third, it requires a lot of data to think in terms of a population. Statistics are only accurate when considering large numbers. When there are large numbers, though, they allow for population-level predictions. In its first phase, in the 19th and early 20th century, statistics came into being due to the state's collection of data and the assembly of data in other kinds of bureaucratic institutions. Historian Ted Porter, in his book Genetics in the Madhouse, chronicles how data from asylums that were originally assembled merely for bureaucratic reporting requirements eventually served as the foundation for the statistical analysis of eugenesis. Pre-existing data stores can be put to a broad variety of uses. Similarly, today, population methodologies depend on harvesting the even larger amounts of data that exist in various repositories: the internet, electronic medical records, wearable health devices, genome projects. There's vastly more data today, so researchers can make much more accurate predictions. Fourth, these database predictions would ideally allow one to influence a population through some kind of intervention. The goal of these interventions is to optimize population outcomes, to shift total morbidity, total death, or to decrease rates of obesity, for example. However, the focus is towards shifting a distribution rather than on directly affecting individuals. Okay. So before I enter into what I see as the ethical problem with these, with this population project, let me introduce two caveats to my discussion. First, the population perspective did not replace reductionism, individualism, or determinism. Instead, both coexist in the popular and scientific mind. Two seemingly opposed ideas can coexist. Witness how today people can imagine that their moods and actions are determined by genes or neurons or neurotransmitters, yet still at the same time view themselves as autonomous actors. In some ways, precision medicine depends on a combination of determinism and probabilistic reasoning. We can see this better if we compare the way some eugenicists thought about the relationship between population and individuals and how this relationship is considered today. Before scientists emphasized kind of Mendelian heredity, natural philosophers tended to envision development as the unfolding of the specific potentialities of an individual organism. Similarly, Carl Pearson emphasized what he called a diathesis, a set of individual tendencies and potentialities that made up an organism. These were more like general inclinations than determinate trait. For all his coming up with the tools of statistics, Pearson was greatly influenced by German Romanticism. He had a very organic kind of concept of life. Because of the uncertainty of how they might unfold, it was hard to control this diathesis. The complexity of heredity suggested to Pearson that population changes occurred slowly over time, as in Darwin's theory. It was difficult to translate population-level insights to the individual, and thus he himself never recommended specific policy options. Mendelian genetics' connection of a particular traits to single genes revolutionized discussions of heredity. Rather than a diathesis, a tendency, scientists could discuss a solid causal determinant. The current population paradigm doesn't pronounce determinisms like molecular genetics, but rather speaks in terms of propensity or probability. Still, it ties these probabilities to particular genes. The probabilistic future is mediated through the atomistic risk of individual genes added together. But actually, this is one of the things that's criticized in polygenic risk score. They don't take into account the way in which different genes actually change how, when they interact and shift, how much influence they can have on a trait. This population perspective eschews mechanistic analyses of causality, like gene A leads to trait B, but instead embraces a positivism dependent on large data sets that are almost uninterpretable in terms of traditional biological mechanisms, hence the black box nature of AI. A second caveat to what comes later in this talk, I think the emergence of a population perspective has by and large led to important advances. It allows us to think about health in relation to social determinants, giving much more consideration to issues of social justice and social structure. Vaccination, a population intervention, is probably medicine's most valuable tool. Further, the growth of the data infrastructure should allow for better kinds of research, like pragmatic clinical trials. Data sharing and data analysis is already optimizing cancer treatment. There are thus many benefits to the population perspective. But, and I'm an ethicist, so there's always going to be a but these developments always also raise a host of ethical dangers. Every conceptual advance has its dangers. And I'll spend the remainder of the talk outlining 4 dangers of the population framework, especially from the perspective of Catholic ethics. The first concern regards how power is wielded in this system. It tends to be exercised in hidden ways or through incentives or nudges that can undermine the patient's prudential judgment through things like wellness program or the practitioner's clinical judgment. Take, for example, the way that population health management is envisioned not only as a way to improve health, but also as a way to contain costs. The idea put forward by health policy advocates like Donald Berwick is that reducing population risk will also reduce future disease across the population, thus lowering cost for treatment. To improve outcomes at reduced price, insurers and health systems are starting to base their reimbursement rates for physicians on metrics. Ostensibly metrics that aim at maintaining health, but in fact, these metrics frequently look at how well doctors manage populations. For example, accountable care organizations put in place by the Affordable Care Act are reimbursed in part through quality metrics. Ideally, these would be outcome metrics like numbers of death, heart attacks, hospital readmissions, right? These kind of hard outcomes that we all want to achieve. And many of them are, but the problem that is that it's difficult to equalize outcome metrics between different health systems because outcomes depend in large part on the starting population. For example, a clinic in a poor inner city area with a heavy burden of chronic disease, homelessness, and drug use will nearly always have worse outcomes than a clinic in a wealthy suburb for reasons beyond the quality of care given in the clinic. These are very different populations. Because of this, many quality metrics are what are called process metrics. They prescribe a specific task to clinicians. Are statins prescribed when there is high cholesterol? Is metformin prescribed when risk of diabetes is at a certain level? Many of these process metrics relate to managing population risks. This management of population risk through metrics will almost inevitably impinge on clinical judgment. The practitioner is no longer considering only whether this pharmaceutical is right for this patient given his total life and medical circumstances. She is also considering how the decision to prescribe, or especially not to prescribe a medication, will affect her quality metrics and thus financial reimbursement. This is the whole point of incentive systems, to shift judgment so that the practitioner will kind of consider how things will affect a population. Now, practitioners are not pleased with these systems. Physician and ethicist Farr Curlin describes, quote, the invisible social engineer standing in the corner of every exam room, armed with a checklist the doctor must follow in order to ensure that she provides quality care that is safe and value-based. Neither patients nor physicians call the shots. Physician Justin Mutter describes how, quote, the denotation of clinical reasoning in much of contemporary medical education literature is already reflective of a transition away from providers' judgments towards statistical and algorithmic computation. As these doctors point out, there are clinical problems with these systems, since population-based risk scores don't always clearly apply to an individual. For example, there might be good reasons not to put an elderly patient on blood pressure medication because it may increase the risk of a fall in a way that outweighs any benefit to cardiac health. It's clinical judgment that allows for the translation of population-based data to the lived situation of any particular patient. The population perspective tends to prioritize the thoughts and priorities of management, though, and these systems of management can disrupt the practitioner's prudence in ways that are ethically problematic. In the Christian vision of action, persons are called to use their intellect and free will to creatively respond to the call of God in the moment and to the needs of others. This free response allows individuals to realize their flourishing by contributing to the common good. It is this theological anthropology that undergirds important principles of Catholic social thought, like the dignity of work. Rationalized systems of population management prevent that free response to the particular other by regimenting action according to guidelines, and in so doing threatens to undermine the dignity of the medical worker. Troublingly, these trends will be accelerated as corporations integrate different kinds of information and tools into the clinical workflow. AI-guided recommendations of medicine and procedures will not be merely suggestions, as they come with the threat of decreased reimbursement if not followed. AI systems will seek to control practitioner behavior and thus raises deep problems for clinical judgment. If the concern under a reductionist view was the total control over offspring exercised by the doctor through genetic knowledge, something that was never really a realistic threat, now the concern is new forms of bureaucratic power and nudging implemented through technology. This overriding of judgment undermines the imago Dei characterized by reason and free will. The second concern that I have is the population's vision of community. At a first glance, a focus on the collective population would seem to embrace the values of Catholic social teaching, like the common good or solidarity, in contrast to earlier forms of individualism or reductionism. Yet it is in fact very different from the Catholic perspective because it considers an abstract statistical collective rather than a concrete community of persons in relations. On the one hand, population health enthusiasts see its instantiations, like precision medicine, as ways to reinforce social solidarity. By caring for all of the population, precision medicine could become we medicine as opposed to the me medicine of curative care or highly individualized prevention. So population health turns towards the community and the common good, according to many bioethicists. In population medicine, however, solidarity is not formed as a bond with concrete others or an actual community. Instead, it is a solidarity with statistical others in a population. The common good is embodied in the statistical metrics of the population. However, by turning from the concrete other with whom one pursues a common end to the abstract population, these authors betray the original meaning of solidarity and the common good, or at least that's what I argue. Of course, solidarity is a famously amorphous concept. Here, I'll define solidarity as a disposition or virtue. As John Paul II said in Solicitudo Rei Socialis, a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good. It is a disposition similar to what Aristotle calls civic friendship, a well-wishing to the other that arises from a shared purpose and a shared work. That's why it's so characteristically located in groups who engage in shared labors, such as unions. The common good that is aimed at is not a statistical description of the population. It's not an aggregation of individual external goods like health or wealth. Instead, the common good includes shared purposes and a form of social relationship that arises from the joint pursuit of these internal goods. Solidarity is the concrete attachment that supports the participation of all in seeking this common end. This older ideal of solidarity contrasts with solidarity oriented towards statistical measures found in the population perspective. Statistical data refers to populations whose individual constituents are abstract and ideally equivalent in all but the metric considered. In contrast, politics and justice deal with a community of irreplaceable persons. In public health and public policy discussions, the conflict that I describe as between statistical and concrete others is known as the debate between saving statistical lives and saving identified lives. It's really a debate between prevention and cure. A commonly used example of the problem involves a mine rescue. Why should we spend millions rescuing 33 trapped mine workers when the same amount would save many more lives if spent on safety improvements that prevent mine accidents in the future? The question comes down to whether to prioritize the lives of the individual mine workers who are currently trapped over all the possible future people who, statistically, could be saved by a preventive intervention. This framework indulges in an abstraction from the person that one confronts. A person with a disease or trapped in a mine must be seen as part of a population of many such deaths, abstracting from the concrete suffering of their situation. Now, the most commonly recognized objections to equating statistical and identifiable lives draws on the impossibility or at least the dreadful effects of performing this effort of abstraction. Objectors point to the empathy elicited by immediate suffering. It would be harmful to medical care to have doctors who engage their suffering patients in an abstract way and instead of responding to their illness, judge them in terms of their cost in regard to population metrics. Moreover, rejecting the priority of identifiable lives might undermine communal solidarity because solidarity is built upon practices of commitment towards concrete others. This connects to my third concern, how a population conception can change our understanding, how the doctor can lose sight of the individual patient. Even when medical practitioners engage actual patients, they can still do so under the form of a statistical vision.
With electronic medical records, for example, doctors' visions are already drawn to data even when the patient is directly in front of them. If AI-driven computerized decision support systems are integrated into electronic medical records, these will nudge practitioners to judge the patient in population terms through their recommendations and the information they provide. Through them, institutions encourage the doctor or nurse practitioner to view the patient only in terms of whether the prescribed medication reduces population risk. Given the short length of most appointments, practitioners have little chance to grasp the social and personal world of the patient. Thus, patients can become statistical lives to the practitioner even when they sit directly in front of her. This changed vision of the patient can lead to great cruelty in the guise of care. I have previously written of high-risk patient programs whose data analytic framework constantly forces doctors to judge whether individual patients are providing an adequate return on investment. Those who don't are dropped from the program. Finally, there is the danger that those patients whose health cannot be optimized will be eliminated from the population. Now, there are two different general strategies by which to control the risk of disease in a population. One approach tries to change the structure of the population as a whole, to move where the average is. So, for example, decreasing the average weight of the entire society or decreasing the average blood pressure of everyone. Most of population medicine tries to affect everyone's health, with interventions attempting to shift the entire normal curve of society. A second approach, however, addresses only those at highest risk. This can be just looking at this kind of top 10% of the population. This can be through treatment. Give statins only to people with the top 10% of blood cholesterol levels, or at the highest risk of a cardiac event. Alternatively, though, people can act by eliminating or excluding those at the highest risk from the population. Kind of just cut off those at the right end of the curve, which will also shift population averages. Insurance companies used to do this through the exclusion of pre-existing conditions. The high-risk patient program I just discussed did it by dropping the worst risks from the program. It can be done at an even earlier stage, though. For example, the company Genomic Prediction promises to reveal a child's future to her parents. If a couple is undergoing IVF, the fertility clinic can select a cell from each of the developing embryos and send them to the company for sequencing. Genomic Prediction offers polygenic risk scores for conditions like hypertension, coronary artery disease, breast cancer, skin cancer, prostate cancer, as well as diabetes and schizophrenia. As you might suspect, these are not tests that will tell whether the child will surely have a disease, kind of like classic genetic tests. Instead, the tests predict in what part of a population curve the child's likelihood for a condition will fall. How much more susceptible to heart disease than average will this child be? The tests predict relative risks, which are comparative numbers. Still, parents are willing to compare their embryos and only implant the ones with the best odds for health and success when compared to the population at large. The company is even offering these tests for things like intelligence, things that aren't diseases like height, and kind of use it to say if your child's might be at the risk of being the lowest 10% of this in comparison to average, you might want not to have them. These allow parents to maximize possibilities of success of their child. Philosopher Julian Savulescu has gone beyond merely justifying such a use of genetics. He argues that such procreative beneficence, as he calls it, giving one's child the best statistical probability of success, is an obligation. Those embryos that are not statistically optimal are discarded. Such destruction of life merely because of where they fall on a normal curve is an affront to dignity and a rejection of the preferential option for the poor. Thus, I'm concerned about the uncritical acceptance and even celebration by our healthcare institutions of practices and technologies imbued with the population perspective. They pose dangers to our understanding of ourselves, our communities, and the role of medicine. Their implementation might limit the scope of judgment and lead to the destruction or marginalization of the weakest among us. This is not a call to reject this perspective, as it also contains the potential for much good, as I said. It's rather an invitation for deeper reflection on it. It's relatively new, so neither the Catholic tradition nor bioethics has yet fully wrestled with the implications of population metrics and statistical methodologies. It's something we must do if we wish to ensure that the healthcare system that's now coming into being neither reduces patients to their molecule nor abstracts them in a population, but respects them as persons. Thank you.
And we have ample time for Q&A. As we do, though, I ask that you wait for the mic to come to you so that our online audience can hear your question. This won't amplify your voice in this room, though. So,
I really appreciated the talk. It strikes me when looking at a population, I think of manufacturing, where this is used a lot in order to pick out, try to sense things that might suggest that this manufactured unit's going to have a problem, and then you can remove it from the population you sell. Works really well there because even the existence of a manufactured unit, you can assign a value to, and whether it cannot exist, and you can put a numerical value for it, and that's okay. But when it comes to human persons, every person has infinite value, and that God loves them infinitely. And I think that, to me, that seems like the main difference as where some of these problems you're alluding to can happen when we're looking at medical treatment of individuals within a population. But as you said, it's a tough tension because while every person has infinite value, we have, as a society, a finite amount of care we can provide, and everyone has a finite amount of resources they can provide. So, yeah, it's a difficult tension, and yeah, I don't have a good answer to it. And I guess I didn't really ask a question, but those are my first thoughts based on what you talked about.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it does involve this kind of putting a price on people. Generally, that's what this is used for, is trying to kind of put a price on people and kind of say, how do we optimize our relationship to someone? I mean, especially when you're getting to this kind of cases where you're going to be killing people, right, or through genetics, or discarding people from programs if they don't seem to be a significant enough return on investment. And that's where I feel these population judgments can really be kind of a problem, right? Is this kind of way of starting to judge people in these economic terms, judging them according to risk, these kinds of elements. That's when but it also can have a problem because you're just judging the person, even when you're trying to help them, you're just judging them not in terms of their narrative, in terms of the richer kind of aspects of their life, but in terms of these statistical metrics, right? Which you lose a lot of kind of depth and richness to your engagement with the person in that way. But yes, I mean, we do have, that's why, but there's also the way that we can use these to kind of figure out where should we give resources, where are there disparities in certain people who are kind of at more risk or sicker or things like that. Can we use these to help them? And I think that's ways in which these kind of population analyses can be very helpful. But there's dangers to them as well.
Brother Mateusz, Mandalay Seminary, you spoke about many things. I'd like to ask, out of curiosity, just about one. I understand that one problem is that we draw conclusions about individuals from entity called population. And now it is my understanding that what enters into population are fragmented pieces of information from many individuals, and not only, and they are kind of mixed. Now, would it help to secure more firm output from population if we restrict input data to whole human being? So like it is actually a real person who existed with these with this set of conditions, characteristics, and so what I am asking is, what are the elements of population, fragmented pieces of information or whole human beings. Therefore, if we make if we try to apply population to individuals, if we know that all the elements are whole individuals, at least one of them existed and had this, if you understand me. Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, the problem is that you can't, so to do statistics, you have to do it numerically on something, right? It's a numerical analysis, and you can't capture a whole person through a numerical description, right? And, I mean, this is in some ways what AI and big data is trying to do. They're trying to capture more and more information about each of us, all of your electronic medical records, all of your kind of genetic data. They're trying to create a digital twin of all of us, but none of that captures the kind of depth of the person, right? You can't get everything in there, or the kind of novelty. I mean, it's all data from the past. It's all comparing to other people who existed in the past. So it creates these kinds of problems. Statistics are very helpful in many ways, right? You can do things with them, but you have to kind of be concerned about their limits.
So first, thank you very much for a wonderful talk. And I take your points about the potential dangers of population-based studies. However, some population-based studies are better than others. And I want to probe you a little bit more about one in particular you mentioned, which is the risk of cardiovascular disease from high cholesterol levels. As I'm sure you know, this is not just about statistics. Long before there were statistics, population statistics, and even before there were genetic analyses, there was a huge amount of lipoprotein biochemistry, mouse models of atherosclerosis and things like that. So how can mechanistic scientific data modulate the effects of population studies?
Right. I mean, I think this is a huge conflict in evidence-based medicine right now. Is kind of there's a lot of people who want to kind of rely a lot on kind of mechanistic analysis, right? Like you're saying, can we use the mechanistic analysis to inform the populations? There's another side of people who are kind of just doing clinical trials, clinical trialists, who just want to rely on clinical trials, right? Randomized, controlled, large trials, right? They don't trust anything with just purely mechanistic kind of functionalist analysis. So this is an argument that's going on within medical evidence. It's the arguments over medical evidence itself. And yes, I mean, I think what functional studies generally do is suggest a pathway forward for what kinds of kind of pharmaceuticals we should develop, right? We can develop things to target things, but those have to be justified in phase 3 clinical trials, right? And that, I think, in primary prevention, statins do reduce risk, but there's so much debate over how much and when they should be due and how broad you should spread the net and things like that.
Peter Casarella, Duke Divinity. Thank you, Paul, for this brilliant analysis. I wanted to ask an annoying metaphysical question about human freedom. Because one thing I took away from this is that the hidden mechanisms of power that you analyze biopolitically are always in play, even when the doctor and patient think they're making free decisions, because of the implementation of actuarial science behind the scenes. And that's really interesting because, I mean, the question is whether or not we can use our free will, but then behind that is the question is what is diminished, or what do we become blind to about what the freedom is in the free will when it's actually used in the face of these biopolitical mechanisms. I wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I go into this in some depth in my book, Tomorrow's Trouble, about kind of ideas of freedom and what they're being used for. So yeah, I mean, I think in the clinic, right, if the computer spits out, the AI spits out a recommendation, the provider may say, oh, I'm freely accepting this. But we already know that when people engage in automated processes, they develop a bias, an automation bias, where they rely more and more complacently on the machines. So we start to kind of lose our kind of freedom in a certain way in that kind of moment of formation. But I think even more deeply, addressing your kind of metaphysical question, I think social media is more of a better example of this. The way that people who are using kind of nudges and population perspectives are thinking of freedom is not, and Shoshana Zuboff goes into this in wonderful in her Age of the Surveillance Capitalism. People who design these systems think about us in a very behavioralistic manner, as people who are probabilistically responding to stimuli, right? We're stimulus response machines. I think that analysis of us is wrong, but people who run TikTok develop such powerful cues. They can kind of charge us and addict us so that we start behaving in that manner, right? It's not that we lose our system, but we are placed into social systems that kind of are so good at manipulating us, so powerful, and that don't respect our freedom in that way, that we start acting as if we're just behavior stimulus response machines.
Do you know what the average medical student would receive as part of his or her education? I assume they get all the population studies and the statistical analysis and the information technology and the uses of AI, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Do they get any countervailing presentations, concerns of the ethical concerns you've been outlining and talking about this afternoon?
So to take your second, well, let me start with your first point. Medical students are actually not that well trained in statistics and reading studies, right? There's a lot of evidence showing that doctors are frequently unaware of what the likelihood of their treatments are of actually kind of affecting health. Doctors think that when they prescribe a statin, they have this idea of, oh, I'm going to extend lifespan or reduce the risk of heart attacks by like 40% or something like that, some huge number, like tenfold, orders of magnitude difference of the actual effects that are shown in the literature. So, I mean, far from being against statistics, I think doctors and people need to learn a lot more about statistics and really how to read the literature. I think we'd be in a much better place if people engaged the literature more. As to the ethical side of things, I don't think medical students are getting a training in this yet. I think people are starting to think about AI ethics. And there's a lot of voices in medicine who are concerned about the introduction. I mean, people are concerned about electronic medical records. People are concerned about clinical decision support systems. There's a lot of kind of pushback against that. The question is, since so many doctors are now employees of health systems, how much power will they have to kind of push back against that?
Yeah, so thanks for your really wonderful talk. You're speaking my language. I really appreciate, as a primary care doctor, really appreciate your perspective. But I want to ask you about a particular practice that as a primary care physician, I do with patients, which is talk about screening tests. Because as you say, the patient sitting across from me, when I talk about a screening test, what they really want to know is not, is this going to benefit me? What's the likelihood this is going to benefit me? And for any given screening test, the chance of that is almost nil. Really. I mean, a number needed to screen for, an average screening test is in the order of thousands. So the likelihood that this patient here is going to benefit from mammography or colonoscopy or what have you is essentially nil. However, unless the whole population does it, no one benefits. In that, one could say that in subjecting myself to a colonoscopy, even though I personally will be unlikely to benefit, if I and my peers do, somebody might be saved. Someone's life might be saved. It won't be me, but it's someone else. So I guess as a Christian, should we interpret screening tests as an imposition on the person of this sort of biopolitical, a sort of a bad imposition of the statistical perspective on the individual? Or is it an exercise of solidarity or somewhere in between?
Right. No. Okay. So I mean, I think I'd prefer to talk about vaccines in that way, because I think vaccines are a much more clear kind of way of solidarity in the common good. Especially, it's not likely that I or my children will have measles, probably. But if we all get measles, we can get rid of measles in our society, right? So that is actually where doing this wide population thing is actually leading to a greater social good. Screening tests, again, there's broad debates about this, right? Screening tests can reduce deaths from particular cancers, but all-cause mortality evidence is fairly low, bleak for a lot of the screening tests, right? I mean, if you look at the literature and the kind of secondary reviews. And the problem that I see with screening tests is that they're not innocent. They lead to all of these kinds of anxieties that happen. They lead to biopsies, right, which are surgical procedures. They lead to overtreatment and overdiagnosis. So that's my concern with treating risk in that way, or kind of searching for risk necessarily. Now, I think it's different if, like, a woman has had had family members dying of kind of breast cancer, right? Her aunt has died of breast cancer, and she wants to look if she has the BRCA2 gene or something like that. The kind of, the screens make much more sense. But, I mean, I think my bigger concern is that a lot of our medicine is now treating risk, which I think is frequently expensive and anxiety-provoking in a lot of ways.
Thank you, Dr. Scherz, for the very insightful and straightforward and clear talk. My question, you mentioned that you think doctors should be more informed about statistics and they should understand how to actually work with a thing. Can you envision a possibly virtuous use of AI in medical technology? I'm thinking of the example specifically of the digital twin, where people make the argument, oh, well, you can model drug combinations or effects of the treatment without actually doing the thing to the patient.
Yes, so I haven't investigated the digital twin too much. I'm a little bit skeptical of how much you can do in silico versus how much you can do in vivo. Like, I have an inherent skepticism of that these can be directly translatable. But I think there are a lot of ways that AI can help in medicine. I think there's some simple kind of diagnostic things like, in cancer, not exactly a digital twin, like certain people had this cancer with this kinds of genetic profile. We did AI to kind of run through this, and this is the kind of treatment that worked best on them. So precision oncology has a lot of successes like that. In terms of kind of relationality and encounter, I mean, I think a lot of the ways that a number of health systems are starting to put in this kind of ambient large language models that will kind of transcribe the appointment and use that to fill out the electronic medical record so that the doctor doesn't actually have to kind of fill in the boxes. That's a way in which AI can actually support encounter. So yeah, I'm not against AI. I just think you need to figure out how to use it well in a way, thoughtfully, not just to kind of reduce costs, but to improve the internal goods of the health and encounter that's involved in the medical situation.
We have a question from our online audience.
One anonymous attendee asks, with the increased computational power of AI, the outputs generated from algorithms have the potential of producing more accurate predictions that improve overall population flourishing, but go beyond our human agentic understanding of the reasons why. Does this black box aspect of AI computational power produce a tragic dilemma, a decreased agency versus increasing overall population flourishing?
Right. I mean, I think what the opacity does, right, especially in this situation where people are probably going to be judged you have to, the institutions are going to try to force people to kind of follow AI recommendations or give you or decrease your reimbursement if you don't follow the AI recommendation. I think the problems that arise there is that, take guidelines now, like with clinical guidelines, if you know that your patient doesn't reflect people in the clinical in the studies that made up the clinical guideline, you have reason to push back, right? You can look at the information that went into the clinical guideline and push back against it. If it's black box, you don't know why the AI has made that decision. You don't know the reasons. You can't use prudence, you can't use reasoned logic to fight back against the AI. And I think that's where we get an undermining of kind of rational free will.
And one last question.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. Very fascinating. And I think proposes a lot of avenues for different kinds of exploration. And one of them that stuck out to me is kind of how this dovetails with some of the field of media criticism. So the ideas of like Neil Postman and Marshall McLuhan that the technologies we use contain ideas within them and they're not neutral. So what my question is, you know, since these tools are getting better and better, part of the thing that put a halt to the eugenics in your description was there were technical problems about actually making these measurements. And then also we had the Nazis, so that shook us out of it. But if these tools get better and better and the memories of those things kind of fade, you know, you have the effective altruist kind of outlook on the world, looking at if we could potentially save X billion of people in 2,000 years, what kind of costs can we incur on existing persons? So absent kind of some kind of theological grounding, how do you maintain sight of the human person, and what are guardrails that can be put on these technologies?
I mean, I think, you know, I don't think I'd want to say absent a theological grounding. I think kind of pushing that theological grounding is very important, and like a good, firm vision of the person, I think it's important. I think that kind of, you know, you don't need to ground it theologically, but I think a rich kind of Catholic vision of the person is very attractive to many people, right? And I think most clinicians don't want to just be functionaries enacting an AI's recommendations. Most people in the world don't want to do that. So if you can give them a vision of, okay, if we enact this the wrong way, that's going to really kind of remove your agency, right? And I think that's one way to push back. Yeah, I mean, I don't think this is all going to be as, I also have some doubts as to how effective this is actually going to be down the road, right? So, I mean, I think that's still a very open kind of question, whether this is actually going to reduce costs, or even whether a lot of these AI systems that we now have will be able to be monetized in an important way. So, I mean, I think those are open questions. I mean, you take effective altruism, a lot of their interventions, you know, ask development studies scholars, a lot of their interventions are not as effective as they would say, right? A lot of the things that they suggest don't actually scale up. You know, that people do randomized controlled trials of development interventions, and frequently there's a failure when they try to scale up because they realize that the initial interventions relied on human relationships between the people enacting those programs. And it's really hard to scale up virtue, kind of, and people who actually care for the suffering person in front of them. So, I mean, I think that's another way to kind of fight back.
I think that we've all had a wonderful treat here, not only with the rich conversation that we've had throughout today and this rich back and forth, but also we've all been able to experience just a taste of what some of our graduate students will be experiencing this summer as they join for our first ever AI Catholic Thought and Ethics seminar led by Paul Scherz. Thank you again to our co-sponsors and especially the John Templeton Foundation. Thank you, our audience, for joining us and participating in this rich conversation. But I'd be remiss if I didn't invite you to join me in thanking one last time our final presenter today.